We begin with Central Asia. The region stretches from the Caspian Sea in the west to China's border in the east. It's made up of 5 former Soviet republics, sometimes referred to as the Stans: Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Turkmenistan. Japan has been engaged in the region since the countries gained independence in the 1990s from the Soviet Union. Japan has been a key partner, fostering international trade links and providing a gateway to other markets. To help us unpack why Central Asia is so important, I'm thrilled to be joined by Nicholas Sejchany. He's a senior fellow and deputy director for Asia at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Welcome, Nick.
Thank you, Fred. Pleasure to be with you.
Pleasure to have you with us. Well, Nick, let's dive in. Japan was one of the first countries to establish ties with Central Asia after the Soviet Union dissolved. Why has this region been so strategically important for Japan?
Well, I'd start with geography. I mean, the stands, as you refer to them, connect East Asia, South Asia, Russia, the Middle East, and Europe. So it's a really strategic part of the world geographically. And then historically, of course, it was the center of trade in the international system, if you just think of the Silk Road. So I think for those two reasons, when the Soviet Union broke apart in the 1990s, Japan moved very quickly to establish diplomatic relations with the Central Asian countries, mainly to try to help them transition to a market economy, which was a common strategic objective in the post-Cold War era. Initially, it was focused on the region's energy resources. So large companies like Itochu, big trading company, Inpex, one of Japan's biggest petroleum developers, moved very quickly in the 90s to try to extract oil resources in the Caspian Sea region. But Japan also moved to expand its official development assistance to the area under the rationale that helping these countries develop stable systems of government, foundations for economic growth, infrastructure, would stabilize the region and also enhance Japan's economic influence. So in 2020, for example, Japan was the third largest ODA provider to the region among the so-called DAC, or Development Assistance Committee countries of the OECD, third behind France and Germany. So over 30 years, Japan has become a real strategic player in supporting the economic development of the region, but also increasingly looking at the region in the context of strategic competition with China and Russia.
So as you put it, geographical reasons, historical reasons, resources such as energy and ODA, but also timely given the geopolitical situation right now with the U.S. and China, the tensions there, and the war in Ukraine.
So as I mentioned, you started with a focus primarily on commercial ties, economic infrastructure. But in the mid-2000s, Japan started to take an ideological approach. In 2006, Japan introduced the concept known as the Arc of Freedom and Prosperity, which was a diplomatic strategy aimed at Central Asia and connecting Asia to Europe. Japan's moniker is a free and open order based on the rule of law. And that's a very good phrase to use in Central Asia, because those countries don't want to have to be stuck in the middle of strategic competition between the U.S. and China. They don't want to have to make hard decisions about balancing relationships with Russia, China, or other countries like Japan. But every country can get behind stability and order and the rule of law. So I think Japan's found the sweet spot now. Still emphasizing norms, but doing it in a subtle way to enhance its influence in the region.
Well, Nick, building relationships comes with challenges. What are the main issues that Japan has faced in engaging with Central Asia?
Japan cannot match China dollar for dollar or yen for yen. So its biggest challenge is to present a compelling case for why Central Asian countries should be willing to engage countries like Japan. And I think it's done it in two important ways. The first is with an emphasis on infrastructure, basic infrastructure that all developing economies need. And the other is on human resource development. So since Japan got in the 90s, it has been training civil servants in these Central Asian countries, sending its own experts to those countries to provide technical expertise, to teach the countries of Central Asia about how to manage businesses. You can imagine in a post-Cold War setting how compelling that was, because these countries were all dependent on a centralized system run by the Soviet Union. Japan has those skills and can share them with confidence. So I think Japan's advantage now is really about the quality of the assistance that it provides, because it's never going to be able to overwhelm these countries with economic resources the way China can.
What solutions or innovations has Japan brought to the table?
Well, I think Japan has a role to play in the context of mitigating the impact of climate change. Japan has been engaging the Central Asian nations in promoting decarbonization through what's known as the joint crediting mechanism, where Japan can transfer clean energy technology to these countries and also meet its own emissions mitigation commitments under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And Japan long ago established a dialogue with the 5 Central Asian states, and most recently they met for the 9th time a couple of years ago, and all the participants agreed that decarbonization and climate change mitigation was an important priority. And these are countries that are feeling the impacts of climate change. For example, Uzbekistan, with melting glaciers and the need to create ways to sustain the water supply. These are very pragmatic needs and critical challenges that Japan can tackle together with the Central Asian states. So I think if it identifies areas such as that and demonstrates concrete ways in which Japan can support the economic development of the Central Asian states, that is a great way to contrast with arguably buckets of money from China, but not really the tools needed to promote sustainable growth in the future.
Well, Nick, earlier on, you talked about how Japan was early on in focusing on Central Asia, but we've also seen growing global interest in Central Asia. So how is Japan positioning itself for the medium and long term so it can foster diversified trade and economic relationships?
Well, there's no question that the Central Asian states are in the middle of this larger geopolitical competition between the superpowers in the international system. But I think because Japan got in so early and has an over 30-year history of economic engagement with this part of the world, it has succeeded in creating a diverse portfolio, if you will, defining how it engages economically with the region. Since the war in Ukraine started, Japan has engaged the Central Asian states consistently on the prospects of creating a trans-Caspian Sea transportation route to facilitate trade that does not pass through Russia. So clearly a geostrategic push with clear economic consequences, and then supporting these countries with their energy transition to manage climate change. So I think Japan's greatest strength is actually its agility and its willingness to engage these countries in a diverse range of issue areas, and backing up that engagement and economic support, again, with an emphasis on governance, stability, or the long-term tools for sustainable economic growth. These themes resonate, and Japan has a lot of credibility as it approaches these countries in the region.
Well, finally, looking to the future, what untapped opportunities could Japan explore with Central Asia?
Yeah, I think for Japan, it's not so much creating new avenues of cooperation, but doubling down on the successes of its experience thus far. And in this context, I would really focus on Japan's approach to official development assistance, or ODA. For over 30 years, Japan has been training civil servants in Central Asian countries to strengthen governance in the region, It has been strengthening ties with the business community, encouraging best practices, and then also supporting the infrastructure development, which of course is foundational for economic stability and prosperity into the future. So I think Japan, with an emphasis on stability, economic prosperity, good governance, just basically the basic tools that developing countries can use to prosper well into the future, is a really good recipe for success. And I think in this broader context of instability around the world and strategic competition between China and the democratized countries that have really shaped the international order for several decades, this is Japan's strategic play. And I think it's a subtle but effective way to really enhance its influence in Central Asia.
Well, thanks, Nick.
Thank you.
Great to have you with us, and thanks for sharing your insights on this region. Well, it's clear Central Asia holds lots of potential, and Japan seems to be well positioned as a trading partner in shaping its future.